Hi there, it's me, Scott, again. I'm going to do another book reading. Haven't done one in a long time, since last year. Last one I did, I believe, was Flowers in the Attic, when I heard the movie was coming out. Basically what I'm going to do today is I'm going to read from one of my all-time favorite books, and one of my absolute favorite Stephen King book. Oops, let me move my finger. It! My favorite one. Awesome book. And so, the miniseries is okay, but book's better. Read the book. Chapter I'm going to be reading is chapter 3. It's right when main character's Bill's his little brother's playing with his boat, and that's when he first meets Pennywise. So, here it goes. Chapter 3. Now here he was, chasing his boat down the left side of Witcham Street. He was running fast, but the water was running faster, and his boat was pulling ahead. He heard a deepening roar and saw that 50 yards farther down the hill, the water in the gutter was cascading into a storm drain that was still open. It was a long, dark semicircle cut into the curbing, and as George watched, a stripped branch, its bark as dark and glistening as sealskin, shot into the storm drain's maw. It hung up there for a moment, and then slipped down his side. That was where his boat was headed. "Ah, shit, and Shinola!" he yelled, dismayed. He put on speed, and for a moment he thought he would catch the boat. Then one of his feet slipped, and he went sprawling, skinning one knee and crying out in pain. From his new pavement-level perspective, he watched his boat swing around twice and momentarily caught in another whirlpool and then disappear. "Shit and Shinola!" he yelled again, and slammed his fist down on the pavement. That hurt too, and he began to cry a little. What a stupid way to loose the boat. He got up and walked over to the storm drain. He dropped to his knees and peered in. The water made a dank, hollow sound as it fell into the darkness. It was a spooky sound. It reminded him of, "Huh?" The sound was jerked out of him as if on a string, and he recoiled. There were yellow eyes in there, the sort of eyes he had always imagined, but never actually seen down in the basement. "It's an animal," he thought incoherently. "That's all it is, some animal. Maybe a house cat that got stuck down in there." Still, he was ready to run, and would run in a second or two, when his mental switchboard had dealt with the shock those two shiny yellow eyes had given him. He felt the rough surface of the macadam under his fingers, and the thin sheet of cold water flowing around him. He saw himself getting back up and backing away, and that was when a voice, a perfectly reasonable and rather pleasant voice, spoke to him from inside the storm drain. "Hi, Georgie," it said. Georgie blinked and looked again. He could barely credit what he saw. It was like something from a made-up story or a movie where you know the animals will talk and dance. If he had been 10 years older, he would not have believed what he was seeing. But he was not 16. He was 6. There was a clown in the storm drain. The light in there was far from good, but it was good enough to see. It was good enough so that George Denbrough was sure of what he was seeing. It was a clown, like in the circus or on TV. In fact, he looked like a cross between Bozo and Clarabelle, who talked by honking his, or was it her? George was never really sure of the gender. Horn on Howdy Doody Saturday mornings. Buffalo Bob was just about the only one who could understand Clarabelle, and that always cracked George up. The face of the clown in the storm drain was white. There were funny tufts of red hair on either side of his bald head, and there was a big clown smile painted over his mouth. If George had been inhabiting a later year, he would have surely thought of Ron McDonald before Bozo or Clarabelle. The clown held a bunch of balloons, all colors, like gorgeous ripe fruit, in one hand. In the other he held Georgie's newspaper boat. "Want your boat, Georgie?" the clown smiled. Georgie smiled back. He couldn't help it, but it was the kind of smile you just had to answer. "I sure do," he said. The clown laughed. "I sure do. That's good. That's very good. And how about a balloon?" "Well, sure." He reached forward and then drew his hand reluctantly back. "I'm not supposed to take stuff from strangers. My dad said so." "Very wise of your dad," the clown said, and the storm drain said, very smiling. How, Georgie wondered? Could I have thought his eyes were yellow? They were bright dancing blue, the color of his mom's eyes and Bill's. "Very wise indeed. Therefore, I will introduce myself. I, Georgie, am Mr. Bob Gray, also known as Pennywise the Dancing Clown. Pennywise, meet George Denbrough. George, meet Pennywise. And now we know each other. I'm not a stranger to you, and you're not a stranger to me. Correct? Georgie giggled. I guess so. He reached forward again and then drew his hand back again. How did you get down there? Storm just blew me away, Pennywise the Dancing Clown said. It blew the whole circus away. Can you smell the circus, Georgie? Georgie leaned forward. Suddenly he could smell peanuts. Hot roasted peanuts. And vinegar. The white kind you put on your french fries through a hole in a cap. He could smell cotton candy and frying doughboys and the faint but thunderous odor of wild animal shit. He could smell the cherry aroma of Midway sawdust. And yet under it all was the smell of flood and decomposing leaves and dark storm drain shadows. The smell was wet and rotten, the cellar smell. But the other smells were stronger. You bet I can smell it, he said. Want your boat, Georgie? Pennywise asked. I only repeat myself because you really do not seem that eager. He held it up smiling. He was wearing a baggy silk suit with great big orange buttons. A bright tie, electric blue, flopped down his front, and on his hands were big white gloves, like the kind Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck always wore. Yes, sure, George said, looking into the storm drain. And a balloon? I've got red, and I've got green, and yellow, and blue. Do they float? Float? The clown's grin widened. Oh yes, they do. They float. And there's cotton candy. George reached. The clown seized his arm, and George saw the clown's face change. What he saw then was terrible enough to make his worst imaginings of the thing in the cellar look like sweet dreams. What he saw destroyed his sanity in one clawing stroke. The float, the thing in the drain crooned in a clouded, chuckling voice. It held George's arm in its thick and wormy grip. It pulled George toward that terrible darkness where the water rushed and roared and bellowed as it bore its cargo of storm debris toward the sea. George craned his neck away from that final blackness and began to scream into the rain, to scream mindlessly into the white autumn sky which curved above Derry on that day in the fall of 1957. His screams were shrill and piercing and all up and down Witcham Street. People came to the windows or bolted out into their porches. They float. They float, it growled. They float, Georgie. And when you're down here with me, you'll float too. George's shoulders sucked against the cement of the curb, and Dave Gardner, who had stayed home from his job at the shoeboat that day because of the flood, saw only a small boy in a yellow rain slicker. A small boy who was screaming and writhing in the gutter with muddy water surfing over his face and making his screams sound bubbly. Everything down here floats, that chuckling, rotting voice whispered, and suddenly there was a ripping noise, and a flaring sheet of agony, and George Denbrough knew no more. Dave Gardner was the first to get there, and although he arrived only 45 seconds after the first scream, George Denbrough was already dead. Gardner grabbed him by the back of the slicker, pulled him into the street, and began to scream himself as Georgie's body turned over in his hands. The left side of George's slicker was now bright red. Blood flowed into the storm drain from the tattered hole where the left arm had been. A knob of bone, horribly bright, peeked through the torn cloth. The boy's eyes stared up into the white sky, and as Dave staggered away toward the others, already running pell-mell down the street, they began to fill up with rain. Chapter 4. Somewhere below in the storm drain that was already filled near to capacity with runoff, there could have been no one down there, the county sheriff would later exclaim to a Derry news reporter with a frustrated fury so great it was almost agony. Hercules himself would have been swept away in that driving current. George's newspaper boat shot onward through nighted chambers and long concrete hallways that roared and chimed with water. For a while it ran neck and neck with a dead chicken that floated with its yellowy reptilian toes pointed at the dripping ceiling. Then at some junction east of town, the chicken was swept off to the left while George's boat went straight. An hour later, while George's mother was being sedated in the emergency room at Derry Home Hospital, and while stuttering Bill sat stunned and white and silent in his bed, listening to his father sob hoarsely in the parlor where his mother had been playing for Elise, when George went out, the boat shot out through a concrete loophole like a bullet, exiting the muzzle of a gun, and ran at speed down a sluiceway and into an unnamed stream. When it joined the boiling, swollen Penobscot River 20 minutes later, the first rifts of blue had already begun to show in the sky overhead. The storm was over. The boat dipped and swayed, and sometimes took on water, but it did not sink. The two brothers had waterproofed it well. I do not know where it finally fetched up, if it ever did. Perhaps it reached the sea and sailed there forever, like a magic boat in a fairy tale. All I know is that it was still afloat and still running on the breast of the flood when it passed the incorporated town limits of Derry, Maine, and there it passes out of this tale forever. It by Stephen King. My favorite Stephen King book. Awesome book. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that. Sorry about my occasional stuttering.